Friends, God is with you.
With your spirit.
A reading from the Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "To you who hear, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. To the person who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other one as well. And from the person who takes your cloak, do not withhold even your tunic. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from no one who takes what is yours, do not demand it back. And from the one, do not demand it back. To do to others as you would have them do to you. For if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. If you lend money to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners and get back the same amount. But rather love your enemies and do good to them, and lend expecting nothing back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and the gifts will be given to you. A good measure, packed down, shaken down, and overflowing, will be poured into your lap. For the measure with which you measure will in return be measured out to you. This is the good news spoken by our brother Jesus.
Praise to you, Jesus the Christ.
Have a seat. Today's readings challenge me perhaps more than anyone in this room. Loving our enemies. At a time, now I'm not proud to say this, but at a time that I would like to face punch some of the players in the evening news, or wonder to myself as I tune in each day if someone has taken down those who are destroying democracy, I have to confess my anger to God on more than one occasion. As Jimmy Carter revealed to America that he had lusted in his heart, on a few occasions I've inflicted harm on some of our current politicians, at least in my imagination. And here we are called to go beyond loving our enemies, really. As Jesus so brilliantly does in his teachings, he sets a standard. And then he says, "But I say," and he raises the bar and asks his followers to take things to the next level. Turn your cheek when they slap you and invite them to hit you again. Give them your tunic as well as your cloak. When asked for a loan, be generous and don't expect to be repaid. Now, as social justice advocates, perhaps it's easier for us to imagine doing these things for the poor. That is a cause that we fight for, giving to the poor. But here we're talking about our enemies, and not just those that we have compassion for. Who is your enemy? Whose enemy are you? How would it be to extend compassion to them? I am admittedly a very thin-skinned person. Beth Rogers will tell you that people who post laughing emojis on our Facebook page get to me, especially if it feels like a cheap shot. Not dialoguing with us about what they disagree with, but dismissing us with a laugh. It feels like bullying to me. And I don't take well to bullying. I can verbally punch back at someone who I perceive as a bully with a vengeance, sometimes only to discover that I had misinterpreted their intent and finding myself needing to apologize for my overreaction. Would I turn my cheek so a bully could take another jab? That would be a challenge. I've preferred the commentaries on this gospel that find hidden meaning behind Jesus' statements. Please, Jesus, let it mean something else. I like the commentaries that say, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, that's a demeaning gesture that one might inflict on someone who's inferior, like a slave. What Jesus really meant was to say, don't let them see you cry. Turn the other cheek, so that if you're to be slapped, you'll be slapped as an equal, thus preserving your dignity. Now that one works for me. But is it what we are really to aim for? In Lamentations 3, we hear another perspective. Some might call it passive resistance. Jeremiah wrote about the suffering of the Jews in Babylonian captivity. He explained that the Jewish captive should offer his cheek to the one who would strike him and be filled with disgrace. In other words, they should bravely receive the insult, the shame, or the humiliation of the slap. Bravely, yet humbly, in a non-avenging manner. Looking forward to their vindication from God. God would judge their enemies in the end. But we want to see our enemies judged now, don't we? We seek justice. We want them to be set straight, to be brought down a peg. Two different kinds of messages here. I was a child when our schools in Urbana were integrated, although the case of Brown versus the Board of Education was settled in 1954. It would be another 12 years in 1966 when the schools in Urbana were integrated. I was in Mrs. Fredrickson's class at Wiley School in the 2nd grade as these little brown faces appeared in our classrooms. All of our teachers were white. All of my friends were white, with the exception of Betty Yen, who was the only Asian student in the school. And I was intrigued, and I was fortunate to have parents who modeled and were engaged in the civil rights movement. And they raised me to be curious and supportive of the children who joined us that year. But there was a moment that has been seared in my memory. A moment when I raised my hand and asked Miss Fredrickson to use the restroom. 3 little black girls met me there, and one of them pinned me to the wall, her hands around my throat, while the other 2 taunted me, and I was afraid. And through the tightness of my throat, I squeaked out, "I don't hate you. I am not your enemy." How many people who voted for our current president have tried to say that to me in one way or another? I've been too angry to accept their claim. Maybe these children were too afraid to accept mine. When I got back to my classroom a little bit disheveled and delayed, I was accused of playing around and not getting back to math. And I told my teacher what had happened. She had all the little black girls in the classroom next to us line up against the lockers and made me point out the guilty parties. I don't know what happened to them at that point, but I do know that I felt really bad. I'd hoped we could be friends. Now, later on we became friends and we all recount that story, but that day felt really bad. Over the years, integrated schools became quite normal in our town, and we all joined each other in the same high school. We played on the same sports teams and ate in the cafeteria at the same tables. We traveled on school trips. You could say we were given the opportunity to gain new perspectives towards one another. A sense of familiarity, in some cases lasting friendships. Today there's a very comfortable bond between the members of the Urbana class of 1977, and the diversity once felt forced upon many became a transformative blessing. The governor of Illinois said in a recent address that the root that tears apart our foundation begins with the seed of distrust, hate, and blame. That was certainly true during the civil rights era, and it is easy to see that in our political divides today. Thich Nhat Hanh would agree, exiled from Vietnam in 1966 for expressing opposition to the war and refusing to take sides. Thich Nhat believed that the root of such violence was based on the misperceptions of each side towards the other. In presenting to the U.S. Congress during the war in Iraq, he advocated for compassion as a means to peace. In this day and age, when we want to tune out suffering, it's just too much to imagine who's going to be hurt by the actions of a few. We certainly can't entertain what some refer to as the persecution of white nationalists, to imagine how they might have become who they are, to understand the things they experience and see from their worldview, to give some validity to their anxieties about becoming outnumbered by people of color, or their efforts to dominate our culture with their ideology. Thich Nhat Hanh says we must not avoid suffering, for it's through suffering that we gain compassion. And through compassion that our eyes are open to others. And our perception changes about those we've considered our enemies. What would it be like to hold a new perception towards and have compassion for those we oppose? But the story of David and Saul adds to the complexity of the theme of loving our enemies. I love this story because it speaks to my tendency to have a knee-jerk reaction. You see, David was being hunted by King Saul and his army of 3,000 men. David had a small force. This is David with the slingshot, right? Taking down Goliath. He had a small force of 600. And his one companion, Abishai. That's like Beth Rogers and I taking down an army. After a 25-mile march south to the wilderness of Ziph, where David was hiding, Saul and his troops set up camp. It was there that David was able to outwit Saul, infiltrating Saul's troops. David and his men found Saul, who was in a deep sleep, with his royal spear planted in the ground next to him, which is a sign that they were indeed in the royal tent. Abner, who was to be guarding Saul, was also asleep. He had failed in his duty to protect Saul. It was a very vulnerable moment for Saul and a perfect opportunity for revenge of David. It would have been an easy kill and a humiliation for a king to be killed by his own spear. Abishai wanted David to go for it. He even offered to do it for David so that David wouldn't have to carry the guilt of the murder. But David took the spear and simply walked away. out of respect for the role that Saul played as a king, a position believed to be anointed by God. And so it was really out of respect for God that David held back. And like Jeremiah in Lamentations, David trusted that God would hold those appointed by God accountable for their actions. But notice that David didn't just walk away. He doesn't take Saul's life, but he does take his spear and his canteen, symbolic of Saul's strength and sustenance, showing it off from a bluff a distance away. But David's display of restraint causes Saul to acknowledge his foolishness, at least for a time being. David kept his distance from Saul after that, knowing that Saul had a habit of flipping his opinions of his perceptions of his enemy, so David was no fool. But you could say that David was exercising Jesus' admonishment that we be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. In the book of Acts, we read about the final outcome of the conflict between Saul and David and the way in which David chose to behave towards this enemy of his. The writer says, "And afterward they asked for a king, so God gave them Saul, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when God had removed him, God raised up for them David as king, about whom God said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will carry out my will." The story of David says to me, when I'm challenged in how to love my perceived enemies, that I serve no one if I become like that which I oppose. If I lack compassion towards those I am accusing of lacking compassion, what good is that? How does that make the world a better place? Jesus is telling us here that we have to do better. Like David, when we refuse to do to others what they have done to us, we let our behaviors stand alone and their behaviors stand alone. We contrast their behaviors by our love, our generosity, our compassion and understanding. If someone displays violence against you, look them squarely in the eyes and refuse to act violently towards them in return. When someone is greedy enough to take your coat or desperate enough to ask you for money, contrast their greed or their desperation with your generosity. When someone deserves to be punished, show them mercy instead. This is how we will change the world, one enemy at a time, by making wise choices in how we react. Father Greg Boyle, who has spent his whole career bringing rival gang members together, is an expert in teaching young men and women how to love their enemies. He's come to understand the transformative power in the simple act of cherishing one another. He says Homeboy Industries is jam-packed with gang members from rival gangs. We don't coax folks to love your enemies. We invite them into a culture of cherishing, where all injuries are healed and wounds are welcomed as trusted friends. Hatred of enemies is no match when cherishing is the air that we breathe. Our own deepening Christ consciousness, Father Boyle says, widens our views, and suddenly we have new containers for things. We don't really have enemies. We have injuries that present as hatred, but are really pain, waiting for our attention and transformation. Doing better than that which maybe we even have a right to do is what Jesus longs for. It is his dream come true. It's a community of beloved belonging where we cherish our neighbors, even those whose politics are different than ours. So my challenge this week for myself is to slow down my reactions, to wait a minute for the anger and the fear to subside. That sense of righteousness when I have all the facts and they are spreading misinformation, when I feel disrespected and gaslit and dismissed for my reactions to that which I know is unjust. To know that the pain I experience in engaging my enemy is a gateway to compassion. And then to choose to let that offense leave me in a long and protracted exhale. The writer Shanti Diva says, therefore, just like treasure appearing in my house, without any effort on my own part to obtain it, I should be happy to have an enemy, for he assists me in my conduct of awakening. And so Jesus calls us to live as awakened people of love. Let us answer that call.
Amen.